Nvidia just launched their new GTX 1650 graphics card, but how does it compare with the next option up, the 1660? In this video, we'll test out and compare 18 different games at 1080p and 1440p resolutions to help you see the performance difference between them, followed by a discussion on value for money. Let's quickly take a look at how the GTX 1650 and 1660 actually differ in terms of specs. Note that things like clock speed and power will vary between specific cards. These are just the reference specs for each model. The 1660 is better in basically every way. It's got 57% more CUDA cores, higher base and boost clock speeds, as well as more memory. For the testing, I'm using the Gigabyte GTX 1650 OC and the MSI GTX 1660 Gaming X. Expect slightly different results with different models. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU overclocked to 5.0 GHz in an MSI Z390 Ace motherboard, along with 16GB of T-Force Nighthawk CL16 memory from Team Group running at DDR4 3200 and dual channel. Check the links in the description for details on all of the components as well as for up-to-date pricing. The same Windows updates and game updates were used for the testing. And for drivers, I'm using the newest available at the time of testing, Nvidia 430.39. So let's get into the results. Let's start out with Apex Legends, which was tested with all settings maxed out. In all upcoming graphs, I've got the GTX 1650 shown by the top bar in red, while the GTX 1660 is underneath in purple. In terms of average FPS, the 1660 is getting 38% higher at 1080p and 33% higher at 1440p. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with the built-in benchmark using high settings. Despite the 1660 looking to be a nice bit ahead here, this is actually one of the smallest differences out of all 18 games tested, which tells you where this is going. At 1080p, the 1660 was 29% ahead of the 1650, rising up to a 38% lead at 1440p. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode rather than multiplayer, as it's easier to consistently reproduce the test run. The 1660 was again getting a much better result, with even the 1% lows significantly higher than the average FPS from the 1650. At 1080p, the 1660 was 47% ahead of the 1650 and 55% ahead at 1440p. Far Cry New Dawn was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings, and we're seeing a 45% performance boost with the 1660 at 1080p, rising up to 49% higher FPS at 1440p. Far Cry 5 was also tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings. And while we're seeing higher average FPS over the newer Far Cry New Dawn just shown, the results between the two cards are close together. At 1080p, the 1660 was 42% ahead of the 1650, rising to 49% at 1440p. Fortnite was tested using the replay feature, with the exact same replay on both graphics cards, so as apples to apples as you can get in this game. At 1080p, the 1660 was 52% ahead of the average FPS from the 1650, rising up to a massive 63% boost at 1440p, and achieving the best result at that resolution out of all 18 games tested. Again, even the 1% lows from the 1660 were significantly ahead of the averages from the 1650. Metro Exodus was tested with the built-in benchmark at high settings. Most parts of the game perform a fair bit better than this, so don't take these results as a good indication of what to expect throughout the entire game. It's more of a worst case. It does, however, allow me to perform an accurate comparison. At 1080p, there was a large 54% improvement to average frame rate with the 1660, rising up to a 57% increase at 1440p, one of the biggest differences out of the games tested. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings. And with a 1080p resolution, the 1660 was coming out 53% ahead of the 1650. And then once stepping up to 1440p, there was a slightly larger 56% improvement with the 1660. Rainbow Six Siege was tested using the built-in benchmark at high settings, and was another title where the 1% low from the 1660 was ahead of the averages from the 1650. At 1080p, we're looking at a 49% improvement to average FPS with the 1660 over the 1650, which rises a little to a 52% boost at 1440p. CSGO was tested with the Ulenical FPS benchmark, and the differences here were on the lower side compared to most of the other games covered. At 1080p, there was a relatively low 19% increase to average FPS with the 1660, while 1440p saw a much larger 43% improvement. Overwatch was tested in the practice range, as I can easily perform the same test run compared to playing with bots or other players, which will vary every time. At 1080p, this game saw the biggest difference out of all 18 tested. The 1660 was averaging frame rates 57% higher than the 1650. Then at 1440p, it was second place with a massive 61% improvement. PUBG was tested using the replay feature, with the exact same replay at high settings. And I don't think either are really great for 1440p here, though with lower settings, the 1660 should go alright. Anyway, in terms of differences, at 1080p, the 1660 was 39% ahead of the 1650, and 35% ahead at 1440p. Watch Dogs 2 was a resource-intensive game, and was tested with very high settings. In my opinion, this one doesn't need a high frame rate to play. I can get by with a solid 30 FPS, so the 1650 was a little behind here, while the 1660 played fine. In terms of differences, at 1080p, the 1660 was 42% ahead of the 1650 in average FPS, and 49% ahead at 1440p. Ghost Recon was tested with the built-in benchmark and high settings in use, and is another resource-heavy game. The 1660 was 41% ahead of the 1650 at 1080p, and 49% ahead at 1440p. The Witcher 3 was tested with Hairworks disabled. At 1080p, the 1660 was achieving 53% higher average frame rates with a slightly larger 56% increase at 1440p. And like most others that I didn't bother mentioning, the 1% low from the 1660 was even ahead of the average frame rate of the 1650. Strange Brigade was tested with the built-in benchmark using Vulkan and was maxed out at ultra settings. At 1080p, we've got one of the largest differences out of all games tested, with the 1660 54% ahead of the 1650 in average FPS, and also 54% ahead at 1440p too. Doom was also tested using Vulkan, and it was still quite playable even at 1440p on the 1650 with above 60 FPS averages. However, the 1660 is a fair bit ahead here, with 53% higher average FPS at 1440p and 51% at 1080p. Shadow of War was tested with the built-in benchmark and saw the smallest difference between the two out of all 18 games tested, with just a comparatively small 17% bump with the 1660 at 1080p and 23% higher FPS at 1440p. In terms of overall improvement, over all 18 games tested with the 1080p resolution, on average the GTX 1660 was performing 43.6% better when compared against the GTX 1650 in terms of average FPS. It really depends on the game, however there are clearly some big gains to be had from the 1660 in most games. At 1440p, on average over the same 18 games, the GTX 1660 was now scoring a little higher compared to the 1080p results just shown, now with 48.8% higher average FPS in these titles. In general, we're seeing a larger difference between the two, as 1440p should be more GPU intensive when compared with 1080p. I definitely don't consider the 1650 to be a 1440p capable card though. However, as we've seen, even the 1660 handles it fairly well even with higher settings. Given that there is quite a fair bit of performance difference between these two graphics cards, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Nvidia released something like a 1650 Ti at some point in the future to fill in the gap like they've done in the past. Here's what we're looking at in terms of synthetic benchmarks. I've just tested 3DMark's Firestrike, TimeSpy, and VRMark here. I'll note that in TimeSpy with the 1650, I did have some black screen flickering which some others have reported, so I'm not 100% certain whether that affected results. As for the differences in total system power draw, the system with the 1660 was drawing 33% more power for an average 43% performance boost at 1080p and 48% increase at 1440p, which to me sounds pretty fair. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as prices will change over time. The 1650 just launched at $149 and can currently be bought for that price on the low end. As we've seen in my recent video where I compared the 1650 against AMD's RX 570, the 1650 is pretty bad value comparatively, as the 570 is both cheaper and performs better. At the moment though, the 1660 is the next step up in Nvidia's lineup, and launched recently at $219, so $70 more than the 1650. This means that you have to spend about 47% more money in order to get that 43% average performance improvement at 1080p, or 48% better at 1440p. Granted, exact results may differ a little, as again, I'm using a higher end 1660 and not one of the low end options. In the context of an entire system though, the percentage difference will of course lower. Out of these two, I think it's worth paying more for the 1660 if you can afford it. And if you can't, then you should just forget about the 1650 entirely and go for the RX 570 instead. Again, it's both cheaper and performs better. You can find my comparison linked in the description. I'm actually working on a comparison between the 1660 and RX 580 at the moment too, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that one. At the moment, you're probably not going to find either of these cards much cheaper on the secondhand market, as they're both still quite new. However, as they age, that will of course lower the price further. If you were buying today, let me know which card you'd pick down in the comments and why. The GTX 1650 or GTX 1660. And if you're new to the channel, get subscribed for future comparisons and tech videos like this one.